Hello, I'm Rebecca Weber. You're listening to AMAC's podcast, Better for America. Bobby Charles, AMAC's national spokesman, once again joins me today for the Reb and Rob Show. Bobby, welcome back. It's so great to have you with me.
And this is one of my favorite times of the week, Rebecca. There's so much going on, and I know we've got a great group out there listening, so I'm ready to talk it through.
We sure do. And Bobby, here we are in a new year, and no matter what issue we talk about, I think no matter when someone sits on the political, where someone rather sits on the political spectrum, this will be a terribly important year for our republic. And you're so uniquely situated to talk about many of the issues that will define this year. But I really want to zero in on a handful of important issues today and really get your take. First, I think we all know the nation's defense is vital. And we also know that a secure border, strong leadership, and defense budget all contribute to our national security. But speaking of strong leadership, and we're seeing this all over the news these days, what do you make of the recent disappearance of our Secretary of Defense, who recently vanished, it seems anyway, for 5 days with no one really knowing where he was? Can you share with us what you know? Are people making this a bigger deal than it really is?
You know, Rebecca, I think sometimes when you think about an issue, you think about it one way, you come to a conclusion, and then you think about it again and it has a different impression. And then maybe sometimes you come back to your original conclusion. I originally sort of thought, well, this is just an inconvenience or something. But that was really after I thought, gosh, this is strange. And now I've come back to the idea that this is more than strange. This is really, I was a naval intelligence officer and I worked in two White Houses and, of course, worked for Colin Powell. Interestingly, Colin Powell had prostate cancer at during the time when I worked for him. The entire chain of command knew it, up the entire chain, down the chain, wide across the department. Everybody knew it was going to take him a few days to get through it and get beyond it. And so, there was an openness about the whole thing because it was he was a very open guy. But the problem we've got here, Rebecca, and it is a serious one, is that this is an act of really profound bad judgment on the part of Austin. And it tells us something about Biden, too. What do you have? You have a guy who initially said he was getting elective surgery. He didn't tell that to anybody, but that's what he later told to the world, that it was elective surgery after he'd gotten out. What he did is he didn't tell anybody. He went home and said, I'm, quote, working from home. Well, that's a lie. That's an untruth being told to his number two, to everybody down the chain of command and to everybody up the chain of command, which is essentially the president of the United States. He then went under and he had no standing orders to take over in case general anesthesia became a problem. By the way, if it were deemed elective surgery, think about it for a minute. Is there any worse time to have elective surgery when the world is on fire and we've got, Gaza and Israel and we've got the Red Sea and we've got Iraq and we've got half the world and China all leaning in and creating problems for us? This would not be the time to have elective surgery. Well, it turns out it wasn't elective surgery, so that was another lie. But, at the end of the day, he comes out from having been drugged and for 4 days doesn't tell anybody anything again. So the president of the United States didn't know until just a couple of days ago what the whole reason for the operation was. Don't think for a minute that the rest of the world doesn't look in on this and see several things. First, America's national security compromised by an individual who's exercising bad judgment from the beginning to the end. By the way, such bad judgment that the number two was on vacation and there is no number three at the Pentagon right now. So
Wow.
just, kind of left the wheelhouse, what we used to call in the military AWOL.
Yeah.
And then you see the level of respect, Rebecca, that they're paying to the president of the United States. All these people seem to have decided in his cabinet that they can just go freelance. There really isn't a president here. They can go out and do whatever they want to do in an operation, or they can fly around the world, or they can, we can go down through the things that each of his cabinet members is doing. So my take is that it was a tremendous act of bad judgment, compounded by other acts of bad judgment. And frankly, I think if he had been in the chain of command of any other president, he would have been dismissed outright. I mean, Ronald Reagan didn't suffer Al Haig for more than about 10 minutes, and it was done. And this is a situation which is, I don't know, it says to me that no one respects this president, and obviously there's really bad judgment at the Pentagon.
Yeah, I think that you're right to be focused on what it means when a Secretary of Defense vanishes. Do you think by chance the issue, though, is even larger? And I'm sensing that it is. Are we really seeing a breakdown of accountability at the cabinet level, which comes from a lack of respect for this president, a sense that he's not entirely engaged, might not really even be all there. That to me is, I think, what most of our AMAC members are thinking, that we've got a president who's just clearly not engaged.
No, you're right again, Rebecca. I mean, we all try to be. We're not all physicists or chemists or race car drivers, but we are good at studying human nature. We do that in our own families. We do it around us. And we do it with our political leadership. And I think you don't have to be brilliant, but you do have to be a little bit of a student of human nature to look at this president and to say, look, Mayorkas is off doing his own thing and doesn't care. The EPA people don't tell him what they're doing. People just go off and do what they want to do. And you've got now a Secretary of Defense, probably, arguably, based on the way people sit in a cabinet room, the most important cabinet member, deciding that he can go off and do his own thing and not bother to even tell the president. And by the way, when all this came to national attention, Rebecca, it took him another 2 or 3 days to even tell the president
Yes.
that he had prostate cancer. Now, we used to say that if there's something that you don't want to tell the people and you work for the people, you're a target for blackmail. So, on top of everything else, bad judgment triggers a whole cascading set of things to be concerned about, never mind the national security of the country. So, I agree with you completely. And I think the average American looking at this administration, if you put the dots together or you draw the lines between them, what you see is a president who's fading. He seems to be fading in an accelerated way.
That's true.
And you see, I mean, being led off the stage
Let
by
off
his
the stage.
wife, and lack of respect. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah. So, Bobby, what do you think as we look ahead? What are the biggest national security threats that we face in 2024?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because oftentimes in a presidential election, national security plays sort of a background role. I personally think that our whole definition of national security has expanded. And if you could flip it on its head for a minute, just call it the insecurity of the American people. The American people are concerned about drugs in their communities, illegal aliens all over their communities, high crime in their cities, and now increasingly in the suburbs. I mean, I live up here in Maine, and we had a small city nearby that was, hit by a criminal, in a big way. So, if you remember. So, point
Sure.
being, there's a high degree of personal insecurity going on because of the bad decisions at the national level. And then when you think about it in real terms, you've got Taiwan being a target. You've got Iran on the march all over the Middle East. I mean, they would like to rule the Middle East. We're not pushing back. We're just appeasing them. You've got Israel under fire. You've got this proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. So national security, and it bleeds over into economic security, and it bleeds over into your own personal sense of security when you walk around your town or your city. This is a major issue in this cycle, and all of those things that I mentioned there genuinely contribute to it. I mean, we're talking about 7 million illegal aliens that weren't here before he got here, high inflation rates, high interest rates, high level of insecurity for reasons tied to that, and then you've got more than 100,000 kids dying a year from Chinese fentanyl, and Biden doing absolutely nothing. So, I feel like at the end of the day, most presidential cycles, national security isn't front and center, but I think it is this time.
Interesting. Thank you, Bobby. It really covers a lot of ground. And Bobby, that observation really feeds directly into my next topic. And this is one that we all care about a whole bunch. I know that this might be asking a lot, but can you give us a top-down view of the cases that have been brought against the leading Republican candidate, former President Trump, and where you think they may end, along with implications they may have in this election cycle? I think everyone knows that this is a year to watch.
Yeah, no, you're right, of course, and talk about issues that are going to be front and center in the election.
Mm,
Election interference by the Biden administration in trying to literally nobble their leading opponent in every possible way, including abuse of the legal system, is a clear, unprecedented way of trying to maintain or keep power. Let me try to sort of digest the whole world and bring it into a
yes.
short sort of block here. You have essentially four sets of cases. You have the cases in New York, which are state level, and in Georgia. Both of those are in trouble. Both of them are transparently political. I mean, it's quite obvious to everybody looking at this that there's a real political agenda going on here, and these very possibly, based on events in the last week, one or both of those could get thrown out. I do think eventually they end up at the Supreme Court, and I think the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court has very little appetite for tolerating really things that are abuse of process, they call it, abuse of the law. And so I think they're going to throw those cases out. You then have two sets of cases brought by Jack Smith on behalf of Merrick Garland, that bitter old man that wanted to be on the Supreme Court and didn't get there. And those two sets of cases, one has to do with classified documents. You don't hear anything about that case because that thing is just stumbling along and there's no there. So I don't think that, it also includes a Fourth Amendment violation that could be adjudicated by the Supreme Court and probably would go in the direction of Trump. And then the only other two things you've got is this other Jack Smith case, which they just had a hearing on it this past week. I expect that the Democrat appointed, very partisan district judge and circuit panel, two of the three judges on that panel were Biden appointees, ironically. So if for some reason he were an illegitimate president, then their appointments would be illegitimate. So they're not going to get real excited about trying to vindicate Trump. But that particular case will also go to the Supreme Court, and that'll be a First Amendment question. Does a president of the United States have the right to give a speech as the president of the United States and not be prosecuted for that? I think the answer is yes. Did an insurrection of any kind occur? And this is the last little piece of all this, and that is states trying to use the 14th Amendment, Section 3, to knock him off the ballot. Maine, one individual, a very partisan state official, and tried to do that in Maine. And in Colorado, I think 4-3, a Democrat-appointed panel tried to do the same thing. The real question there, Rebecca, all turns on this idea of insurrection. You'll notice that they're trying to say that President Trump incited an insurrection. But if you pull back the curtain and look at what has happened legally to the 700 or so Americans who were either on Capitol grounds or walked through the Capitol or ran around the Capitol breaking things, certainly criminal acts, but those individuals, not one has been charged with insurrection. So, and the reason is that the prosecutors know it wouldn't hold. You couldn't make that case stick. So at the end of the day, how can you have someone prosecuted for inciting an insurrection that no one was charged for and really ultimately can't really be called an insurrection? And I'll footnote this, Rebecca, and I apologize for the long answer, but here I'm going to footnote it by saying I was Colin Powell's, yes, I clerked on the Ninth Circuit, and yes, I know the law, but I was Colin Powell's assistant secretary. I went to parts of the world in which real insurrections had occurred and were potential. And we're talking about automatic weapons and dozens of people dead, including the leadership of the country. This was not an insurrection, okay? This was a riot, and people got out of hand, and they should be prosecuted for that. But when a few hundred people out of 120,000 behave badly, and we'll just wind the clock back to 2020 and talk a little bit about, maybe even the earlier times when you had the streets on fire, in this country with leftist radicals. When you get a lot of people together and they have a lot of emotions, some of them are going to misbehave, and that happened here. But I think this is going to turn his way. I think that the rulings at the state level, I cannot imagine them allowing anybody to be kicked off the ballot by one state official, because if you do that on one hand for reasons that are subjective, then 25 or 26 or 27 states are going to kick Biden off on the other hand, and now you basically have a civil war with no weapons because you have one group of people being voted and another. So I don't think that's going to be allowed by the Supreme Court.
And how does one person or a handful of people make a decision to take someone off the ballot when millions of people are looking to vote for that individual? It just seems absolutely terribly unfair. And as we watch what's happening in Georgia, and we're learning so much more, I mean, what's happening there is unbelievable. We've got a DA who hired a special prosecutor who she's got a personal relationship with, who she has traveled with, who she's paid upwards $1 million with funds that were not really allocated or didn't go through the legal process to ensure that things were done the right way. So it'll be really interesting to see how that whole thing unfolds and whether or not they, in fact, are charged in the end. But I do think it's time that we get to truth. Truth is so important. There's a lot of mudslinging, and people get caught up in what's real, what's not real. And I do think rule of law is so important. Following our Constitution, not inventing new rules along the way. That's certainly not the way that it was intended. All of this is now coming to the surface. I think more and more people are waking up. They're seeing the truth. And I do hope and pray that that people can get to the truth online, that we don't have these social media sites and other big conglomerates like Google, for example, that's censoring a lot of the truth. So this is really important. It's the reason why we do this show, Bobby, is so that we can have a conversation. You're not going to find this kind of information out there. But I want to move on and just ask you, what do you make of this bizarre approach that Biden has taken? And this is not talking at all about his own accomplishments. Well, he's got very little. He can't really talk about Bidenomics because the average American is turned off by Bidenomics. So what he's doing is he's relentlessly attacking Trump and the over 70 million Americans who support him. I mean, have you ever seen anything like this?
No, so the short answer is no, Rebecca. I've never seen anything like it, and I've studied campaigns back to Richard Nixon. I mean, I worked for Reagan in his White House and Bush 41, and I watched Clinton and Obama. Never seen anything like it. And I think that the thing that really disturbs me is if you look at the speech that Biden gave a couple of years ago, saying that the rest of us were enemies of the republic, that we were somehow anti-democratic by having opinions that disagreed with him. And then you look at this January 5th speech that he just gave. It is frighteningly similar to the kinds of speeches that came out of the mouth of people like Chernyenko and Andropov many, many, many years ago. It is essentially saying one-party government is the only way to truth. It's saying you have to keep us in power because the other side doesn't believe in, well, pick your poison, but doesn't believe in the Constitution. That is, of course, utterly untrue. The people, and you say 70 million, and of course you're thinking back to the last election cycle, I'm going to bet you that by this point it's closer to 100 million Americans say, I can't stand the untruth that keeps coming out of the mouth of this president. I can't stand the giggling attitude toward issues of massive importance coming out of the vice president. I can't stand the AWOL attitude of the Secretary of Defense. I can't stand the appeasement coming out of the Secretary of State. I can't stand the lies and the walking away from the border coming from the Secretary of Homeland Security. I can't stand the personal and political persecution coming out of the Attorney General of this president. These people, Americans, are sick and tired of this kind of lies being put over them. We're not fools. We're quite well aware of what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And I don't care where your educational level is. I don't care how old you are. I don't care where you live. If you can get enough of the truth, you know what the truth is. So bottom line is, I think it's scary because what Biden's doing is he's demonizing all the rest of us. Anybody that supports Trump is somehow now a villain. That is not true. And the incredible part is that when Trump potentially wins or a Republican wins and Trump is part of that, one way or the other, I think a lot of Americans are going to come back around and say, you know what? I was never part of all that demonizing. I would like a good economy and a good border and a good national security. Let's hope at least.
That's right. And speaking of truth, we know that the Hunter Biden laptop was indeed real. And I feel that it seems that the Biden himself perhaps has his back up against the wall. And, when you've got your back up against the wall and people coming at you, the natural tendency is to fight like hell, because otherwise they're coming at you. What is the status of the scandals surrounding President Biden and the Biden family as a whole? And where do you think that those may lead? In other words, could that impact the probability of Biden remaining on the ticket, in your view?
Yeah, you're really asking the seminal question right now, Rebecca. And if the Democrats at the highest levels beyond the administration must be thinking to themselves, if this gets any hotter, we're not going to be able to hang on to it. At this point, you've got Hunter Biden. Never mind the fact that you've got a pro-Democrat, very politicized Justice Department. Even they cannot look away from the truth that has gotten out into the public about Hunter Biden. And once you begin to pull that thread, you're ultimately talking about Joe Biden having been the beneficiary and his family of tens of millions, if not more. Some people say $100 million from China, Romania, Ukraine. These documents are all out there now, and the Republicans are really ramping it up. So you really do come back to this cornerstone question: are the Democrats going to continue to cover up and going to continue to defend a criminal, a guy that really should be brought up on charges himself and many in his family for felony bribery, never mind the impeachment, but felony bribery, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, RICO violations? Are they going to continue to defend him and essentially go down with the ship? Or are they going to flip themselves over and decide they're going to pick some new Democrat and they're going to excuse him and let him be historic and maybe resign in a way that allows, the interesting part about all this, Rebecca, is that resigning, if they go after Trump, and which they're doing, and if they say that he can be prosecuted after office for acts conducted in office and become criminally liable, which is an immunity question before the Supreme Court shortly, that would mean that Biden himself is probably, if he's still alive, going to go down in a heap of flames, because he's obviously, there's many colorable claims for criminal activity against both him, his brother, his son, his family. So, we're in this moment where Democrats have to make a real question of conscience, and it shouldn't be that hard, but apparently it is. Do they want to support a criminal to be their nominee, or do they, and someone who clearly is not really up to the job, or do they want to pick someone else? So I guess we'll find out. I don't really have any prognostications here. I don't know.
Bobby,
I really don't know.
who might that someone else be? I mean, do you have any
Yeah,
thoughts or ideas? I know that's a question
I
that
do.
lingers. You do?
I do. I do. And I'll tell you, so Democrats, remember, a lot of the reason that the polls are rising for Trump is that Democrats and independents are quietly saying they're not going to support him. Now, I suppose if we want a slam dunk landslide for whoever the Republican nominee is, then just keep Joe Biden on the ticket. The problem is with public corruption and election integrity issues and others, I don't want to really run the risk, of putting, someone who's not all there at the steering wheel again. So I think, who would they go to? I think they might go to Newsom, who has made it clear that he'd be interested in the job, even though he pretends that he isn't. A governor of a very leftist governor of California. By the way, people are fleeing California, so I'm not sure how well that would go for the Democrats. Or you could see them try to pluck somebody out of the Senate and try to make them the candidate. I think for sure it won't be. It won't be Vice President Harris, because the only people that don't like her more than Republicans are Democrats.
Yeah.
So I think we're in an odd moment, because we have a divided country, but we also have people who know truth. And you come back to truth again. We know when our paychecks don't go that far. We know when our life savings are being frittered away by inflation. We know when illegals show up all over the place that the border's open. We know when children of our friends fall victim to drug abuse in numbers that are frightening, and the drugs that are abusing can kill them. We know all these things, and we don't want these things. So I think at the end of the day, whoever their nominee is, there's kind of a policy choice that will
Yeah.
probably dominate. So we'll see.
And this really brings me to another area that I wanted to explore with you, and this is the whole idea of election integrity. More and more Americans are seeing that they've been betrayed. They've been lied to by the current administration. I mean, from the disastrous pullout in Afghanistan to concerned parents who are being labeled as domestic terrorists. We've got, as you mentioned, the wide open border. Not only is that killing tens of thousands each year, but we see child trafficking on the rise. This is a topic that we need to be talking more of, because, I mean, it's like a modern day slavery at its worst. The numbers are
Yes.
staggering. Dangerous crime wave across our entire country. Even the vaccine didn't do what Biden promised it would. I think that people have lost faith in Biden altogether. And we saw what happened in the 2020 election. We saw unfolded ballots. We saw 2,000 Mules, a great film. I encourage you people to watch 2,000 Mules. There's a lot there. really will open your eyes to what went on in 2020. Bad voter rolls. I mean, I could go on and on. What should we expect in this presidential election? Are you confident that we will have a free and fair election?
Well, Rebecca, my heart of hearts wants to say yes, and I believe we should all vote. And I guess at the end of the day, I do believe that this election will be predominantly fair. I do think in some of the blue states there will be illegalities, but those blue states probably were not going to line up for Trump or DeSantis or Nikki Haley or some mystery candidate that's on the Republican side either. Anyway, and so I think what we have to the reason that I'm confident that things will work out is that we're all vigilant, all of us. I mean, it doesn't matter what town you're in, what city you're in. People are volunteering to be poll watchers. They're out there making sure their state legislature doesn't tip in the direction of ranked choice voting. They're working aggressively to make sure that when illegalities or potential illegalities or drop boxes or changes that are sort of behind the scenes that might allow the entire country to look like Cook County, Illinois, they're not going to let that happen. They're not going to let that happen. And so, we Americans are very resourceful. The most wonderful thing about us, and I interviewed a lady a couple of years ago who was 100 and something, and I said, you seem to laugh every day still. Why? How can you be, given all the things going on in the world, how can you continue to be happy about the state of things? And she said, I'm not happy about the state of things, but I'm enormously confident that we make mistakes in this country and we have the power to correct them. And
That's what we all have to
I believe,
remember,
yeah,
that
I
we do
believe
have
she's
that
right.
power within us. I do
We
too.
do. We do. And we just have to assure that this is a high election integrity cycle. We just have to
That's
do that,
right.
all of us. And we can. And we can.
There you go. Now, final question. Well, a couple more questions for you, Bobby, but this one's a big one,
Yeah.
really. After the election, right, as the Electoral College
Yeah.
acts, and in general, can we keep the peace, or do you foresee any chance that things could get disorderly between now and then? And then what about after the election? How do you see that?
Yeah.
Because I've never seen such a divided America in my short lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Rebecca, you're asking exactly the kind of question Colin Powell used to ask of us. He would say, I want you to look around corners. I want you to think about not tomorrow or even the day after tomorrow, but 2 days after tomorrow. Where are we going to be? And I think we can predict several things. First, the Democrats will probably, assuming that the Republican candidate really scores well, and I think they will based on everything we know and we can project, and we've already seen in polls all over the country. I think that they will try to distort the electoral college returns. And without getting too deep into it, a state legislature has the power to certify and send on a slate of electors. And really, these news stories about fake electors are all wrong. What happened back in 20 was you had a Democrat set of electors and a Republican set of electors. And you had lawsuits going on, some of which didn't get resolved until February or March. And so in places like Wisconsin, you had a Republican set of electors that was sent on with the Democrat set of electors. Now, there have been some statutory changes since then, but the gist is I could see the Democrats trying to play fast and loose with the electors for the Electoral College. So we've got to watch that. We've got to keep state legislatures, which AMAC is excellent at doing. We need to keep state legislatures accountable. But, the bigger question you ask is the one that worries me the most, and that is when people who have held power and think they should hold power the power is taken away from them by the people. And we've seen this again all over the world. Those people who have held on to power try to stir political violence. And I really worry that the left in this country, the ends to them always justify the means, which means that they would use tools like political violence to try to retain power. And I don't think they would be successful, but I think we as Americans need to constantly be saying we are not about political violence. We do not consent to it. We do not encourage it. We do not want it. And so if we can believe in ourselves, if we can believe in our Constitution and in the process and in election integrity, I think we're going to be fine. But I also think that the left, very likely after the election, they're going to have about 2 months, but before then and the turnover of power in January, I could see them trying to do some radical things. And I think we as Americans need to say we are a country, a form of government based on laws and based on constitutional principles of the kind we find not only in the first three articles, but also in our Bill of Rights. We are not a nation of people. That is to say, people, we don't worship people. We don't have a cult of personality. We're not the Soviet Union. We are all about our Constitution. And so if we can stay with that and encourage those who are political opponents, but nevertheless Americans, to also stay with that, I think we'll be fine.
Very good, Bobby. Now, you bring both realism and optimism to the table, and I think we definitely need both. Let me ask you, I know you've had some pretty heavy weather up in Maine in the past few weeks, as there's been lots of rain everywhere and snow. Do you have any stories for us today? Anything that might lighten the mood or otherwise lift us as we get moving now into the middle of winter and the start of a really important year ahead?
Yeah, so what a great question. And truth is, I almost was flooded out here. Everybody
Yep.
on the eastern seaboard seems to be facing flood conditions. And I could tell a story political, but let me tell a personal one. I am always an optimist. And, I'm always reminded living up here in the Maine woods. In DC a lot, but also up here, that of people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who loved and Henry David Thoreau. They loved the great woods of Maine, and Emerson was the one that said, "Nothing is at last sacred except the integrity of our own mind, and trust thyself. Every heart beats to that string." So we. Self-reliance is a really big principle up here. I mean, you get a lot of snow, and we all over the country. You have natural disasters are not something new and different. They've happened for eons, and so you have to be self-reliant. And one of the funniest things that happened was where I sit right now is on a lake, and there was a creeping flood. The lake itself, because it's backed up, a river backs up into it, rose by 12 feet. That's a
Wow.
lot. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And so what happened was the acreage on which I live became a little teeny island that was just the house. That's it.
I saw the
And
pictures.
water,
They're unbelievable.
unbelievable. It is. And so I'm on a peninsula, but the peninsula was no longer a peninsula. It was an island for just hundreds of feet. So I watched all this with some more, I guess, intrigue than concern. I knew that my basement might not look good after a while, but luckily the lake receded. But I watched a squirrel who would go up and down a tree, and his tree was separated. Once the flood came in pretty fast, so he got separated, and there was no other tree for him to jump to. And so after day five, he'd go up and down the tree and up to his nest. Day five, I saw something I've never seen before, and I'm a student of nature. He came down that tree and he resolved that he would be self-reliant in going and getting the seed and the acorns that were left on the dry land. So yes, we believe in Henry David Thoreau and Emerson up here, and you'll remember probably that Emerson talked a lot about self-reliance. And rather than tell a political story, let me just tell a simple personal story. As this place got surrounded by water, the house I'm in right now, the trees which were furthest away close to the lake were completely surrounded. And there was one squirrel who lived in one of these trees, and he would go up and down the tree, and there was no place for him to jump to. He was stuck. And so interestingly, again, I'm a big fan of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who would say, for example, that we have only the integrity of our own minds to keep us together. Paraphrase. He also said, "Trust thyself. Every heart beats by that string." So be self-reliant, particularly when you're in a place where that self-reliance is being challenged. So this squirrel, unbelievably, came down the tree, and at day five of being separated from dry land, he dove into the water and he swam from tree to tree and then did it again until he got to dry land. And I thought, if necessity is the mother of invention, and if self-reliance is really who we Americans are, that squirrel is an all-American squirrel. He just decided, I am done with this flood. I'm
Diving
getting
in.
on with life. I'm going to go find seeds somewhere else. So,
I
such as it
didn't know
is.
squirrels could swim or swim
I
that
did not
well,
either.
but quite
No.
interesting, Bobby. That's awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you for that laugh.
Yeah.
I think we need to all keep our sense of humor. And what a wonderful reminder that self-reliance is certainly worth having. Bobby Charles, thank you as always for joining me today. And to all of you out there listening, thank you for tuning in to Better for America. Be sure to like and share this podcast with your friends and family so more people know about AMAC. Don't forget to join or renew your AMAC membership. And thank you all for tuning in today. Have a blessed day, and we'll see you next time. Does social engineering from leftist corporations make you feel like we're living in the Twilight Zone? If so, you're not alone, and that's why we're proud to stand behind a wireless company who stands behind your values. I'm talking about Pure Talk, an AMAC-supported wireless company on the nation's largest 5G at half the cost of the big three. So I challenge you to stand with a company who champions your values. Those of you who have always had your neighbor's back, you've pulled yourself up by your own bootstraps, and you still believe that the flag stands for freedom. It's time to join the masses who have fled their old wireless companies for something better. Pure Talk. Pure Talk gives you phenomenal coverage on America's most dependable 5G network for half the price of the other guys, with unlimited plans starting at just $20 a month. The average family saves almost $1,000 a year. And as an exclusive AMAC partner, Pure Talk will give you 3 years free on your AMAC subscription. Just dial 844-8-PURE-TALK and mention AMAC Podcast to make the switch. That's 844-8-PURE-TALK, and make sure to mention AMAC Podcast to get 3 years free on your AMAC subscription.